This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 231 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. We've got an episode today which I think is particularly thoughtful, and it's a really interesting topic for me, I know. We're going to be talking about unconscious bias and travel. So if you're not quite sure what an unconscious bias is, it's basically a stereotype or a social stereotype about certain groups of people that you can form outside your conscious awareness. So you don't really realise, or you don't realise at all, that you hold this bias or prejudice. We often talk about how travel kind of helps you shatter stereotypes that you hold, and that travel makes you a more open-minded person. And I'm sure that basically all listeners of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast are particularly open-minded people and striving not to be prejudiced in any way, but we all have these unconscious biases and prejudices that we just might not realise, and they still are influencing our thoughts and actions. So that's the topic, and I've got a couple of interesting guests to talk on this today. But my little blurb first is to mention the implicit association test, or the IAT, that Harvard started many years back. Now, there's a lot of discussion over whether this test is valid in any way, but it's an interesting exercise to at least go through. My friend Jo sent me this a few years back, in fact, when she was studying recruitment for her human resources degree. So thanks, Jo. I found it so interesting at the time that I've often come back to it. So the IAT, basically it tests your implicit associations about things like race, gender, sexual orientation, and more. The tests are like they're online, they're psychological tests that include a series of images and words, and you just have to identify and match things. And it all seems a bit weird, but the result is that it identifies your tendency for an automatic preference. So for, whether it's a particular gender or race or whatever. So it's this implicit stereotype that you might hold and not really have any conscious awareness or control over it. So I'll leave a link in the show notes in case you want to have a look and try any of the tests yourself. I did a few again. I've done them in the past, and the results have been the same every time I've done them. So that's one thing that the critics say is that the test results often differ. Mine have been the same, both over the years that I've taken them. So who knows? But one that I've taken, and I hate the result, but I'm going to be honest and tell you the result and tell you why I think it's the case and why travel can help. So I've taken the race test, and my results show a moderate automatic preference for European Americans versus African Americans. And that's a horrible result, I think, but I think it is a product of me living always in places where the proportion of black people is either relatively low, like here or Germany, or extremely low, like in Japan. And therefore, I imagine I have this implicit unconscious bias where perhaps it's just because it's not in my usual realm of experience, because I certainly have no conscious prejudice. But for example, I also took the sexuality test, and that gives me the result: no automatic preference between straight people and gay people, which makes a lot of sense to me because I've always had both straight and gay people around me. So perhaps that means I have no unconscious bias in that realm. Who knows? But I think it's important to remember we all have these unconscious biases, and we've learnt from what we've seen and heard growing up, and that one of the best ways to realise and get over them is to have more experiences with all different kinds of people, and that travel is one of the best ways to do this. So, all that being said, my first guest today has a really interesting story about her own unconscious bias that she obviously didn't realise she had, and it all takes place on a train trip in Central Europe. So my first guest is Tonya Fitzpatrick with a great story about her own unconscious bias.
I was traveling between Vienna, Austria, and Budapest, Hungary. years ago, when I had traveled to Vienna to visit a friend, I decided I wanted to go to Budapest, and she was working, so she didn't go with me. And I was living in London at the time, so it was so easy just to hop on over to Austria.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my God, the beautiful hub for travel.
Oh, yes.
But what happened on this trip? I was in a car by myself, and a car sat 6 people, and I was okay with that because I just wanted to enjoy the scenery. And so I'm in this car, and as we started, a family of 6 people came in the car. Now, mind you, the car only sat 6 people.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and so as they were trying to figure out, where else to go, I offered to get up and leave so that they could have the car to themselves, and I'd go find another place. And I recognized their accents. They were from South Africa.
Uh-huh.
And at this particular time, apartheid had been over for years, but I hadn't traveled to South Africa. So I didn't have my understanding of South Africa was all I heard in the news. And I did not want to sit with this family because I didn't think it would be comfortable for me as a woman of color with people who I thought would be, racist. I mean, they were Afrikaners. And, but the mother of the group, or the elder of the group, I guess is her and her children and some of her children's friends. She said, no, and actually everybody in unison said, no, just, stay here. It's okay. So 4 of the travelers sat with me, and 2 others went off on their own. And I had the best time with these people, just chatting and talking about life in the States, talking about London, learning about their travels. And they actually invited me to tour Budapest with them that weekend.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I actually shared a room with the mother of this group.
Oh, how fabulous.
And we gossiped a lot about our family, so I knew all of their business by the end of the weekend. But what that showed me was that we all have unconscious biases. And, my unconscious bias, I was confronted by that because I never knew it existed until, I had this visceral reaction to this family. And, and I was embarrassed. I was very embarrassed that I was confronted with this character flaw that I didn't know existed. And, and for me, the person who talks about unity and connecting communities and, finding your own truth and, for me to not even at that moment live up to my own advice, it's a little bit humiliated. Now, this is well before I started World Footprints, but, I grew up in a multicultural family. And so because of that, I didn't realize that there were some cultures that made me nervous. Yeah. So that was a slap of reality. It was a learning opportunity for me.
Yes. Well, exactly. I mean, I think, unconscious biases are really hard because, well, by their very nature, you don't really realize it until something happens. And then, you handled it well because what an amazing outcome that you ended up having, a close friendship and spending the whole weekend with this family. So obviously you dealt with it well. That's the best outcome we can hope for because, it's not like it's an unconscious bias. So you don't intentionally go out to feel that way. It's things that have happened, information you've received that makes you feel that way. And then, I think you dealt with that very well. And what a wonderful outcome.
Yeah, and they introduced me to cherry brandy that weekend. We went to a bar. And that was such a great thing.
I feel exactly when Tonya said she was so embarrassed by this character flaw that she didn't know existed. That's exactly how I feel when I'm confronted with my unconscious bias. But I think that at least finding ways to be confronted by it is a good start, if nothing else. Now, Tonya actually had a second story to tell me, which was actually the story of a woman that she interviewed on her World Footprints podcast. And it was also a really interesting case of unconscious bias that was helped by travel.
As we spoke about, unconscious biases, I interviewed a guest on our show, World Footprints, and her story is so impactful. She's an African-American woman from North Carolina who returned to her love of music after leaving an abusive relationship. So she was in her 40s, I think, when she went back to music. And she has built a wonderful career as a jazz artist, and she's quite well known in the States. But when she started out, her manager booked her for a music tour in Germany, and she did not want to go to Germany, and she fought him. She ended up, acquiescing to his demands for her to go to Germany because he thought it would, be a good springboard to her career. So she went, and, when she was there, she discovered something. She discovered that she was completely wrong about her opinion of German people. You see, her parents, I think, come from the World War II era, and so all she knew about Germany was what she read in the paper, from what perhaps she heard from her father, who I think was in the war, and she was just not interested. She knew about Jesse Owens and the games during in, I think, Berlin during Hitler's reign, and and just the caricatures of African American people as monkeys, etc. So that was her reasoning for not wanting to go. But when she went, she discovered two things. She discovered that German people love jazz. They love her music, and they embraced her. And she told me, she said, Tonya, as an African-American woman, I was so embarrassed that, somebody who has grown up in an era of racism, frankly, which continues today in this country, but that aside, but somebody who had been subjected to racism, she was embarrassed that she was painting a complete culture with a broad stroke too, and she did not realize that she had this unconscious bias against German people. And so she has been back to Germany a couple of times since, and she actually today calls Germany her second home. I think she owns a home somewhere in Germany. Yeah, I mean, just complete, a
real 180.
Yeah, big time. But that happened because she traveled, and she traveled with an open mind, and she saw for herself. She found her own truth. And, and it changed her life, and it changed her perception of people in general, and I think that was a teaching moment for her too, is, we need to second guess those times when we have very strong opinions about other cultures and places.
Definitely. Absolutely. And even if we don't, it's just this reaction we have, and we don't really even know why. That's always, we should take that as a signal to think, okay, what made me feel this and think this, and can I investigate that a little bit further and figure it out? Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we have to fight fear. Fear can be a very crippling thing. And, sometimes people are afraid to fly, or they're afraid to go to country XYZ because of, these misinformed beliefs that they have.
Such a good reminder of just how much travel can open our minds to all kinds of things. My final and second guest today is Pam Mandel, And she also has some really interesting things to say about her own unconscious bias. And it all happened over the last few years, in fact, when she's been travelling more domestically within her home country of the United States.
So over the last, I think, 5 years or so, I've been traveling a lot more in my own country, which is really interesting because I had a lot of ideas about what the U.S. is like. I live in the northwest corner in Seattle, West Coast, super liberal, way lefty, and I definitely have been fed ideas about what middle America is like. And you are from a very far away place, Amanda. You and I are on different corners of the planet right now. And I think we tell a story about what we refer to as red state America, conservative America, middle America here in the U.S., and what that looks like. And so for me to go to these places I was definitely traveling with a whole ton of misconceptions about what that was like, right? And I think it's 5 years ago now, I did a trip to the Mississippi Delta. And I'm like, I'm going to Mississippi, going to the South. I had never been to the American South. And I definitely had ideas about what this would be like politically, socially, all these things. And I was so wrong. It was so incredible how wrong I was about, what I experienced there. There are certain things that remain true about American history. I mean, Mississippi was a cornerstone state during slavery and this terrible, embarrassing era in our history. But I definitely had a lot of ideas about the types of people I would encounter and how they would welcome me and what they would think about me as an outsider. And that trip was some of the best travel I've done in years. Wow. I knocked around for 10 days by myself mostly. And everywhere I went, people were unfailingly kind. And when you travel, you go somewhere and there are things that make travel great, right? The way your interactions with people who are there, the food, the landscape, all these things, right? But there are also things that make it difficult, just like negotiating, putting gas in your rental car, for example. Like, do I pay now? Do I pay later? I don't understand the keypad on the gas
Which side
tank.
is the cap on the car? Yeah.
Where's the cap on the car? All of that stuff, right, makes travel difficult. I remember, this is a slight diversion, but I remember trying to buy a sandwich at a roadside gas station in Italy. And it took me forever. Like, I had to stand there and sort of observe this thing that was happening. Right. So I order my sandwich and I pay, and then I give my ticket to somebody behind the counter, and then they call me when my sandwich is done. And I don't speak Italian. How am I going to navigate this? Right. So it was an amazing gas station sandwich. And all that said, getting that done is very challenging. Right.
Yes. But
I had great food. I got to see this sort of scene happening. I like small things that sort of are definitive of place. It doesn't always have to be the big things. So that was actually a really great travel experience. So this is a long way around coming back.
I love the long ways. It's all good.
Coming back to this business about knocking around in Mississippi. Well, so I got to have all of these kinds of experiences of sort of figuring out how things work and having these beautiful interactions and seeing this gorgeous landscape, but with none of the hard stuff, right? Like, if there was a problem, I would just ask someone.
Yeah, no language barrier. Yeah.
No language barrier. No, well, a little bit, because Mississippi drawl is a thing.
True.
But I was able to sort of navigate these things and get the information I needed to do so, and still have these very foreign to me travel experiences.
Oh, wow.
So that was really great. So I have subsequently I went to Indiana. I traveled in Indiana, which you may know as Mike Pence's home state, the former vice president of the United States. So you certainly have ideas about what Indiana is like. And I was actually there for a writers' conference, and on the day of the keynote, one of the guys at the conference said, "Hey, I'm going to this concert in a cornfield. Do you want to come?"
Ooh, cool.
Right. And I had been hanging out with the guy who did the keynote because he was from New York and I was from Seattle, and we were both like feeling we had been hanging out, and I said, "Hey, Daniel, Michael, who's this poet, it asked me to come to this concert with him, and I'm going to miss your keynote." And he's like, "I would go to the concert if I wasn't doing the keynote. So you have to go." Anyway, so we get in his car and we go to this concert. And again, you have these ideas about, this is Mike Pence's home state. You have these ideas about what Indiana is like. So we're in this field, stages just set between the barns, beautiful Midwest evening. And the crowd is like, I don't know, 25-30% lesbians, because this band has this particular lesbian following. And I'm like, this is an Indiana cornfield, right? So when I think about the ideas, we think in these very homogenized ways about regions and places. And to discover that I had been doing this myself about my own country, when absolutely I know better in my home state. Not everybody shares my politics here. Not everybody shares my point of view here. But to experience that in my home country, in Mississippi, where I sort of had this preconception about what people's politics would be like, or Indiana, or, other places I have since been, is enlightening and a little bit humbling. And also, for me, it's one of my great thrills in travel is to go somewhere and to find out that I'm totally wrong about a place. I kind of love that.
Absolutely. Because if we knew everything already and we were right about everything, how boring would that be? So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it sort of creates this curiosity about, like, what else is going on here that I don't know about? What other assumptions am I carrying around that are false? I enjoy that tremendously. So, when I saw that one of your topics was unconscious bias, I mean, I'm carrying around a lot of unconscious bias about a lot of things, but explicitly related to travel in the last couple of years and my primarily domestic experiences here in the U.S., especially in a time of such political division. I know you guys have your own stuff going on there in Australia.
We pay a lot of attention to your stuff, don't you worry.
Yeah, I know you do. Everybody's looking at us like, what's going on over there? So to sort of be aware of that, and then to go to what I would think of as like deep in the heart of red state country, and to have these experiences that negate that, I think are really super important, right? So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's so key to be able to, an unconscious bias is unconscious by nature, by definition, but it's important to be putting ourselves out there wherever it is, even if it is in your own country, so that you have a chance to confront these things and learn that, things are not always the way we think they are. And if we just sort of stay home all the time, it's harder to have those kind of realizations and confrontations. It's easy to surround ourselves by the known and know what we're up against all along. But traveling is important for that.
Yeah, I might argue that it's important to do it, especially if it's in your own country, because this is our home. These are our homes. This is where we live. This is, and we need to know each other better because this is where we live.
Pam actually went on to tell me about one of her more recent projects, which is called The Statesider, and it's a website where the mission is to seek out stories about the United States that challenge people's preconceived notions. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to that. There's some really interesting stories there as well. So I hope that this has been a thought-provoking episode, and perhaps you are, like me, recognising or beginning to recognise even some of your own unconscious bias issues. It's tricky, isn't it? And I know if you're like me, and you probably are, you don't want to feel or recognise any of these things, because I like to consider myself extremely open-minded and unprejudiced, but that is not the way of the mind often. So something to work on. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to episode 231 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. A massive thank you to my two guests for their really insightful contributions. First up, I chatted with Tonya Fitzpatrick of World Footprints, and so you can find all of their info at worldfootprints.com. I then chatted with Pam Mandel, which was actually delightful as I've known Pam online for at least a decade from her blog nerd'seyeview.com. It was the first time we'd actually got to speak. Pam's book, The Same River Twice, is out now, and I'll leave a link in the show notes to that, as well as to the Statesider, which we mentioned, which is at statesider.us. I will also leave a link to the IAT, the tests for implicit bias from Harvard, in case you want to try them out yourself. Don't forget to join our group for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook if you're not already there. There's a link in the show notes, or just search for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook. And all of this info is available in the show notes for this episode. The show notes are at notaballerina.com/231. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.